Okay, thank you for joining us again. We are going to be launching into week 2. So last week was our introductory week. This is where we actually start to get into some real content. And we're going to go ahead and get started because this week is a ton of information. It's a ton of information. We're talking about some basic philosophical concepts that are important for building the apologetic case for the Christian faith. And then we are going to really dig into our first big problem of apologetics, and it's whether or not it is reasonable to believe in a deity, whether or not it is reasonable to believe in a God. And so something that we need to start at the outset and explain is we are not jumping right into the full Christian apologetic from the beginning. It's a cumulative case, and we're going to get to the specifics of Christianity later in this study. We start more generally, and so that's what we're going to dig into with what's called the problem of God or the existence of God. Is it reasonable to believe that there is an all-powerful supreme being? And that's what we're going to dig into and get into the evidence and get into the philosophy this week. So I just wanted to head that off because we're like, but doesn't the Bible say, yes, but we're not necessarily going to go into the Bible. We're not necessarily in the Christian worldview yet. We have to get there. Okay? Have anything you want to add to that before we?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope, but we did want to start off with, just like we did last week, just a few questions.
First we should start with prayer.
Well, first we should start with prayer. Go ahead.
Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, we just thank you for this time and this opportunity for us to gather together in order to study your word and study your truth. We pray that this time would be illuminating and moving for everybody who is here to hear it and here to see it, and for everybody who sees this on the recording. We pray that you would send your Holy Spirit into this space so that the truths that are revealed would be what people need to hear so that they have their questions and their doubts and their concerns answered, and that their faith would be encouraged, and that you would be glorified as we continue to study the cumulative case that leads us to the faithfulness that we have and the assurance that we have in our faith in you and in our Lord Jesus Christ and his resurrection. We lift all this up in the name of your holy precious Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so now we will start with a couple of questions. How do you define truth? How would you define truth?
Can you define? Did I turn my mic off? No.
No. It is hard to put in words. You're right.
It really is, because the truth is just the truth. I mean, how we know or how we see it.
Okay, the truth is true.
It's true.
Okay, that's correct. Yes. What else? How might you define truth?
Sean?
Similar to how I might define wisdom.
Okay.
Conformance to reality.
Conformance to reality.
Okay. Conformance to.
Did you cheat?
No, that's how I personally define wisdom.
Yeah.
Conformance with reality.
They seem to go together.
Come on in.
Come on in. We just started.
It is. The truth is, so reality is. The truth is 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Yep.
Right? That's
The-
the reality.
Okay.
The truth is, and therefore that's a reality. We didn't put this in the slides, but when you get to the Aristotelian, which is Aristotle, so the Aristotelian definition of truth and fact, he starts to speak exactly like that. So yeah, it is what it is, and it is not what it is not. And you're like, wait, aren't you repeating the definition in the definition?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yes.
Yep.
What that gets to is the truth is very hard to define in the terms of anything other than the truth. Yeah. Any other ideas on truth? Yeah.
So often you hear that truth is a relative term.
Oh, we're going to get into a lot of that. That truth is relative.
Relativism.
Yep.
My truth, your truth, her truth. That may be true for you, but it isn't true for me.
Yep.
Yeah. That's all hokum, by the way.
Well, we're going to talk about it. Don't worry. Don't worry. Because, yes, you're right. That's something you hear a lot of, especially today, as relativism is relatively well thought of
Yeah,
in our context.
popular.
It's very popular.
So
Okay, so let's go
get
on to
in-
the next one.
Yeah, let's get into some related terms. How do you define a fact?
A fact is something
Something that
that's
is true.
Absolutely. Yep.
Truth is something that is fact, and fact is something that is true,
Uh-huh.
okay? These are hard to do, okay? All right, how do you define knowledge? Sean was already talking about wisdom. What's wisdom? What's knowledge? We didn't get into wisdom, but what's knowledge? How do you define knowledge? How do you describe what you know? This is the audience.
I know. Knowing lots of facts. Okay, so
Oh,
lots
the
of facts that-
accumulation of facts?
Yeah.
Okay.
What
Okay,
you've learned.
accumulation of what you've learned. Mm-hmm. How about faith? When do you have faith in something? How do you know you have faith in something?
You believe it without seeing it.
You believe it without seeing
Okay.
it?
You see it as truth.
You see it as truth?
Mm-hmm.
When does something deserve your faith?
When you know it to be true.
When you know it to be true. Man, we are talking in circles.
Yep.
Okay? Keep going.
Okay. Next question. Do you believe that there is evidence for God? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Nervous
Yes.
cough. It's easy.
Yes. I think there's some evidence for God. So that's really, these are the areas that we're going to cover tonight. Truth, fact, knowledge, faith, and then the evidence for God. And for some, it's a little bit difficult to describe. It's a little bit difficult to define. So we're actually going to take some of the time here at the beginning to define each one of these terms and kind of talk about it a little bit. Because I think it's important that we're all, on the same page and that we're all working from the same playbook. So the first one that I actually want to start with is the definition of truth. This is the definition of truth. And so this is a combination of the dictionary definition of truth as well as sort of truth in our context, that kind of thing. But this is the first piece of the definition of truth. It is the conformance with reality. And so that's in your notes. This is the conformance with reality. And it was even on page 1. No, but that's true. It's that it's aligned with reality. We can, in what we can see, observe, and understand, it is easy to make sure that it is aligned or it is observable and that it conforms with reality. Okay?
But to Dodie's point, it's hard to define because it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
The truth just is. And this is something that we see fundamentally in little kids as well. The truth is such a core concept that it resists being broken down and described by other things, okay? So when you have an appeal to truth, you have a little kid, has chocolate smeared on their face, cookie jar's open, half the cookies are gone. Johnny, did you eat the cookies? No. What's the question? Now, come on, is that the truth? And the little kid goes, no. So a little baby child understands this concept of truth, that, I just told you something. And you say, is that true? And they go, no, that actually doesn't align with reality. It doesn't align with reality. So the truth is one of those things that is notoriously difficult to describe because it is what it is. And what is it? It has to align with reality. And if something doesn't align with reality, it is not the truth.
The second piece to that is that it is a verified or indisputable fact, proposition, or principle. And those three words, fact, proposition, and principle, we don't really get into proposition and principle too much in terms of defining those, but a proposition would be something that you propose as true, right? And so it is it is observable with reality, it is verifiable, and therefore it is either a fact, a proposition, or a principle that conforms to reality. Again, truth is really hard to define. And in fact, it, just as Christopher put up there, it's so fundamental to reality that it actually defies easy definition. One time when I was younger, my stepdad asked me if he came to Earth as he was an alien, how would I describe water? And I said, well, it's wet. And he says, well, what's wet? I said, and so we went down this rabbit hole, right? Because it's one of those things that it's observable reality, you know it to be true, but it's kind of hard to describe. So inherently, just as Christopher was talking about, we know what's true and what's not. Now, there are things that we can question as true because we don't necessarily understand the
Basis behind them?
basis behind them or the verifiable fact, which is part of the reason that we're having this class and talking through this. Okay?
Next one, fact. Definition of fact. So facts are objective. Now, we're using more words. We have to talk about what objective means. Objective means it doesn't depend on you. It doesn't depend on the observer. It's not subjective, okay? So we were talking earlier about, subjective truth. Your truth is true for you, but it's not true for me. Facts are those things that are so fundamental to the world that it doesn't matter whether or not you believe it or not, it is, okay?
And it's as it says, it's a state that exists independent of perception. It also exists.
Advance.
Oh, it didn't advance. Sorry. It also exists independent of preference or your opinion. A fact is objective, meaning it's something that everybody agrees on. 2 + 2 is 4. That is objective fact, right? Mm-hmm. Okay? So the concept of fact is made up of actually 2 different pieces. One of those is the claim to truth, which is considered the proposition, and then the relation to reality. So remember, truth is conformity with reality, and it's an indisputable or verifiable fact. And a fact is something that is a proposition that is then proved to be in relation to reality. So there's a couple of different ways that you can describe this, okay?
So we're getting kind of heady into the philosophy, and we're getting into all these definitions, these words, and it's really difficult to connect to what we're saying because it's all kind of theoretical. So this is best exemplified with an example. That was exemplified.
It's best exemplified.
Demonstrated with an example, okay? So if I were to say unicorns. Unicorns is not a truth, is not a fact. I've not done anything. But now we know what we're talking about. Unicorns are just a thing, a noun, right? Okay? So how do we get from a thing to a truth or a fact? Okay? So unicorns isn't enough. You have to say unicorns are real. Okay? Now I've made a claim. I've made a proposition. Okay? So I've claimed a fact. Right? Fact. Either unicorns are real or they're not real. Okay? Now we have to evaluate the correspondence with reality. Okay? Are unicorns real or not? Have we discovered unicorns in the world? There are people who believe that unicorns exist somewhere, but they're not on this planet. So in order for this proposition, this claim, this truth claim to actually be a fact, we have to amend it. Unicorns are not real. Now, this corresponds with the observable reality in our world, right? So now, we've teased apart truth, fact, a claim, and of a proposition, and then the correspondence. So there's 4 really important concepts. Any questions on that? Okay.
Okay, let's move on to knowledge. There are actually 3 different pieces to knowledge. in terms of its definition. The first one is it's held internally on a given subject. It's the proposition that's held internally on a given subject. So something that you know is something that you hold inside of your mind. You know it in your heart. It is an internal thing to you. It's not an external thing. So that's the first piece of it, is that it's held internally on a given subject. The second piece of it is that it must be objectively true. So it's not an opinion, it's not a preference, it is an objective truth or a fact. And then the third is that there must be good reasons for the belief. So knowledge really has a few different parts to it. And so there is something that you believe, and then you believe it internally. You know it, you've heard it, you've said it, you've learned about it, and then you have to weigh it against whether or not it is objectively true. And so ultimately, all those pieces make up, and whether it's true or whether it's not true, or whether it's preference, or whether it's you're kind of weighing all of these decisions, then that makes up knowledge. And ultimately, knowledge is the collection of what we know, why we know it. And then also, it's what distinguishes belief from opinion. So there's a lot of beliefs that people have, there's a lot of propositions that people make, but they may not be objectively true, and there
may not be good reason
They may
or
not be
evidence
good
for it.
reasons for believing it. Unicorns are real. Is there good reason for believing that that's true? No, we've read about it. We know we have an understanding of unicorns because we've heard about them described in books or seen them rendered in paintings and things. But for that to be actual knowledge, it has to then be verifiable as objectively true, and then there has to be good reason for that belief.
And we don't have to use this term, but as you are studying Christianity, you may run into this as the field of epistemology. And the field of epistemology, just so that you are familiar with that term, is the study of the collection of what we know and why we know it, and what is being distinguished from belief versus conjecture. Okay, that's epistemology.
Okay.
Can you repeat that real quick?
Yeah.
Epistemology is the study of the collection of what we know and why we know it, and that which distinguishes justifiable belief from just opinion or conjecture. Made me think about what I said. Had to recall it.
Okay.
Any questions before we move on? You guys just taking this all in faith, just believing our truths? All right.
That's a nice segue.
George.
Can I have a different set of knowledge than you do?
Sure. Can you have a set of knowledge that I don't have? Absolutely. You may have knowledge around how to build a satellite, okay? I don't have that particular knowledge, but the knowledge has to be internally held by you. It has to be objectively true, and you have to have reason for believing it. But yeah, you can have a different set of knowledge. Anything you would add to
I
that?
think what George might be asking is more, could it be conflicting knowledges? Can it still be?
What do you do with conflicting facts?
And-
That's why we're here, knowledge on a thing that you said, but we both have knowledge on the same thing, but the knowledge conflicts and we both consider it knowledge. I think that's what.
And we are going to get there where we have conflicting
Worldviews.
Okay.
Which, that's in a few slides, and we're going to get to
But
conflicting worldviews and how to reconcile them.
Can we have knowledge that is separately held and conflicting? I suppose if you bring in the concept of objective truth, if it's objectively true, meaning verifiable, maybe we have different pieces that lead to the same thing, but truth should not be conflicting.
Isn't it when life experiences bring people
Okay, but
I
now
think
we're
so.
talking about the difference between knowledge and preference, or knowledge and, but you have to remember that we got to keep preference and opinion out of it. Okay, when we're truly defining knowledge, preference and opinion belong in its own category,
And they're not irrelevant. They're just not part of
this
the
particular
area of
definition.
epistemology. So, George, this is all pretty theoretical at this point. I'm going to put you on the spot. Do you have an example of two different held pieces of knowledge that are in conflict?
Well, like Heather's sermon, a couple weeks, I don't know, a couple weeks or a week ago.
Okay, Heather's sermon on what?
Women can be pastors.
Okay,
Some people say that's not
biblical?
biblical.
Okay, and other people say it is biblical.
Some people say it is biblical.
And no, so that's a really good example. And I don't know if you have a quick way to dig into that. I do, but it's not very quick.
So that is a big rabbit hole that's not the purpose of this study. And the reason I'm saying that is I don't want this answer to come across as flippant or to write it off. I don't mean to be disrespectful in any way. But for those two differently held beliefs, I have two ways to answer that. Okay? One of them is one of those belief systems is based in a interpretation of Scripture that has fundamental errors. The other one is based on an interpretation of Scripture that is true to good exegesis and good Bible interpretation. And that's where Centerpoint as a church has come down, is that our study of the Scriptures, we believe, justifies having women teachers, female teachers. The second way I would answer this is not an area of primary importance. What are areas of primary importance? Salvation. Jesus is the Son of God. He is sinless, and he went to the cross, died, and was raised 3 days later for the propitiation of sins. That one, all Christians agree on. This other one about whether or not women can teach or not, it's one of those things that people can and do fight about it, and it breaks my heart that people can and do fight about it, because it's one of those things that breaks relationships, and it's basically an issue of preference. Like, you choose to interpret this way, we choose to interpret it this way, but it's also not an area that is of an issue of salvation. If you get taught by a woman and we're wrong about this, it's not like your salvation is in peril. So I hope that I did not trivialize or dismiss anyone's concerns on that topic, but that is a good example of two differently held bases in knowledge. You know, women can teach, women cannot teach. Both people hold that as knowledge, and how to reconcile those two. Does that answer your question?
In that area, yes.
Okay.
I
And
don't have a problem with that.
yeah, no, I know. Well, you wouldn't be here if you did. But let me see if I can distill that even further. That there is a difference between objective truth and interpretation. And we need to come down even further in that way. And this is, I have this as a belief. I believe that there are good reasons for the way I believe this, and there is information that I hold and a proposition that I hold internally, but there is such a thing as objective truth, and so in some ways we sort of have to pull preference and interpretation and opinion out of it in as much as we can. Anything you want to add to that, or we?
Sean's jumping up, and then back to George. Sean?
No. Go ahead.
Sean?
I think you guys are trying to say it nicely and be.
You're right. We're trying to say it nicely. The ones who say that women can't teach are wrong.
That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The answer to the earlier question about different people having different knowledges, if we look at this definition that we've put up, you guys are trying to be gentle, but I think the answer is that some things, though we may believe it's knowledge, the proposition must be objectively true even if we we might consider a thing knowledge is just simply not knowledge.
Yeah, it may be preference.
it-
Instead of being knowledge and objectively true, it may just be preference.
And ultimately,
It's mean
yeah.
to say,
No, no, no.
like, but it's just, even if, like, she said, different life experiences
Mm-hmm.
come different conclusions, but if it's not objectively true, then it's.
And one of the things that we talk about in this class, or we will talk about, is what is a more reasonable or more rational or more logical truth.
Yeah, it's a scale.
It's a scale.
Scale. George, you had your hand up again. Do you remember what that was?
Going back to fact,
Mm-hmm.
as an engineer or scientist, fact is something that is provable by other people.
Mm-hmm.
It begins with a theory, and then people go out and prove it,
Mm-hmm.
until it becomes knowledge.
That was an objective, verifiable state. And that means that more than one person can observe it and demonstrate its veracity. Oh, there's a big word. Demonstrate its truthfulness. Yes.
And I mean, let's be very, very clear. And there's a reason kind of we kept this at a super, super high level, because we could go philosophical into
Yeah.
weeks and weeks and weeks of debate.
It gets hairy from here.
It gets, and so we're trying to give a somewhat cursory understanding here.
Yeah, go back.
However,
Go back a slide. Go ahead.
However, if you ever want to get into the deep, heady philosophy that we've studied through, happy to do it. Just not here.
And in the philosophical textbooks that we drew this from, there's a disclaimer that these three points, these three definitions, these three components of the definition, there's a disclaimer. There are issues leaving it just here, but to go deeper is to really kind of go beyond the scope of what's relevant to what we can observe and discuss reasonably. So people who are paid to sit around and think philosophy can really chase this down the rabbit hole and go further than these three and break these three down even further, but it's not a good use of time. And then that same disclaimer says, that being said, these three are good enough for our purposes. So we can go further.
And on any of this,
It-
I mean,
it
as we
just hurts.
even continue to go through these, truly, if you ever want to have a conversation going further and further and further into it, would love to do it. It's just hard to do it in a group class like this.
Okay?
Okay, let's get on to the definition of faith. There are two pieces to that definition. The first is that it's a state of ventured trust, and we're going to get into that just a little bit, in which we risk something. And the second part is that it is applied to something or person. Let's kind of talk about this just a little bit. How many of you have flown in a plane? Okay. How many of you who have flown in a plane know how to fly a plane? One of you? Okay. So here's the concept of ventured trust. And you have another sort of example as well. But you got into the plane, and your faith was that you risked something yourself in order to place trust in something or some person without necessarily understanding everything of that they are doing, and yet you placed trust, and your trust was grounded in knowledge that a pilot who flies a plane and is certified really should be able to get you from point A to point B. You trust that everything in the plane is in working order. You trust that the mechanics checked it over. That is placing faith. I mean, people talk about the fact that faith is, blind belief. That's actually untrue. And it's really, really untrue in the way that we utilize faith as a culture every single day.
So another illustration, and we're going to go back to some of the things that Tricia said. So I have here a little packet. How much does that weigh, Alex? It's 16 ounces, but that's okay. Okay? Weighs
He's
one-
measured it, folks.
weighs
He
1
has
pound.
weighed it
Okay?
out.
This is something made by REI. Do you guys know what REI is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a store that makes camping gear, okay? And this is a little tiny itty bitty thing that weighs 1 pound. It's supposed to be a chair. It's supposed to be a chair. How much do I weigh? Okay? Okay. I weigh, with my shoes and pants and all my gear on my belt and everything, I weigh about 260 pounds. Okay? So this little aluminum thing, is this capable of supporting my weight? Okay? So REI, okay, they say that this thing is rated to 300 pounds, right? So we have to ask ourselves, do we trust REI? Well, what do we know about REI? Okay, they've been in business for 40 years. They are professional manufacturers and makers of camping gear and camping equipment. And even though I have some doubts about whether or not this flimsy little thing can support my weight, they've claimed that it can, right? So do I have faith that REI has built a product that I can trust my weight in? Now, what am I risking? Falling down a little bit. So it's not necessarily a big risk, but it means that you are risking something. You are putting yourself out there to figure out whether or not you can trust what someone else has claimed. Okay? So it could be a big faith, like putting your life in the hands of a pilot in a plane and the physics of aerodynamics and aeronautics, or it could be something small, like whether or not I trust my comfort and safety for falling 6 inches to the ground to a chair. But faith, do you have faith? Now, I had one level of faith the first time I built this thing and put it together. Like, do I really trust REI and their claim that they can build a flimsy little chair that weighs 16 ounces, that can hold 300 pounds? I don't know. So I'm going to ease into it, right? But after I've been using this thing time after time after time, my faith has been reinforced with observation and experience. So, we're talking about blind faith, right? At one point, this was blind faith. I'm reading the specs on the REI website about what this chair can do. And then that faith in that which is unseen, I haven't seen it myself, then gets reinforced with what Diane said about personal experience. And now, because I've had those two things aligned together, I have reason to believe that I can keep doing this. I can keep using this flimsy little chair. Okay? Good example? Yes. Okay. It's not always about the big stuff and getting into a plane. Sometimes it's little stuff too. It's, do you have faith in whatever?
Mm-hmm. And that takes us to the main definition here, which is that faith may have its basis in belief. We believe that the pilot's going to be able to fly the plane, but it requires an action of trust. It is not stagnant. It is actual movement. And then that has to be grounded in reason and knowledge. That's really what faith is. And too often, I think, the definition of faith has been oversimplified to just your belief. And it's certainly viewed from outside the context of Christianity that faith is blind belief. I would probably guess that everybody in this room has heard that term at some point or another. It's blind faith. It's blind belief. But actual faith is a ventured trust, so you're risking something. So why don't people want to risk something? Because they're afraid, or they don't see the benefit. But it has to be a ventured trust in which you risk something. So from our context, we're talking about risking your eternity, risking your willingness to change, and risking your willingness to perhaps give up the things that you hold as priority in your life. And then, but that act of faith, that ventured trust then has to be grounded in reason and knowledge. And so there's sort of a reason that we're giving you, starting with these 4 definitions, and then moving on into worldview. So we already said, relativism is a relative truth is something that people talk about all the time. So very, very quickly, wanted to kind of highlight an area that these 4 things that we talked about, truth, fact, knowledge, and faith, are what make up a worldview. Now, here's where we're going to get into some of the debate. Some worldviews make more sense. They are more reasonable given what we can objectively identify as fact and truth, and based on collective knowledge. So some worldviews make more sense than others, and we're going to do this just slightly differently in terms of another philosophical laws and propositions. And there are 4 different ones real quickly that we wanted to cover. These are some ways to, some things that create a worldview.
Yeah, this
right?
gets into the nuts and bolts about whether or not someone's worldview is entirely valid. And so we were being nice about it earlier, but when someone holds a worldview that has a problem, they may have knowledge that isn't based on accurate facts or a misinterpreted fact. They may not be following the rules where truth can only mean one thing. And so these are the philosophical criteria by which we evaluate worldviews and the claims that they make about their view on the world and the existence and the universe.
Okay, so there are 4 different ones, and we want to kind of give you a quick definition for these.
Get ready to write.
Because then in the next one, we're actually going to go into even more detail about the 8 different criteria for evaluating a worldview. The first one is non-contradiction, which is really what it sounds like. It means it cannot possess incompatible properties.
Yeah, so 2 plus 2 cannot equal both 4 and 5, right? That would be contradictory.
That's the excluded middle. Any factual statement and its denial cannot both be true.
Oh, right. Incompatible properties. I'm sorry.
Meaning non-contradiction. It can't be that Jesus died and rose again and Jesus didn't die. That can't both be part of Christianity, right? You can't have core beliefs that are contradicting. The second one is the excluded middle, which is essentially you can't say this is true, this is not true, and both are correct. A factual statement and its denial, this is true, this is not true, they cannot both be correct. One is true. Okay? And then the next piece of that, the bivalent state.
So this will make sense to programmers. It's the 0 and 1, right? That if something is true or false, there is no middle ground on there, right? It either is or it isn't. There isn't a third option that fits between the two. It's 0s or 1s. It's either all in or all out.
And then the bivalent state is that it's either true or not true. And then the identity, and these are just different ways that philosophers evaluate worldviews, is a thing is itself and nothing other than itself. A equals A. So, for example, I cannot be both 48 years old and 49 years old at the same time. I may be 49 years old the next minute, but I cannot be both 48 and 49 at the same time. Okay? Now we're going to get into even deeper evaluation of worldviews. And these are the criteria that should be used to evaluate the validity or what worldview makes the most sense. And this is the first one. It explains what it ought to explain. That's sort of like defining truth. It's kind of hard to
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to define, but
So it means that the worldview addresses the things that we encounter in our lives and in reality, okay? It answers questions that we have about each other, about existence, about our world. It doesn't go off talking about things that aren't relevant, okay? And that it actually does address the things that are relevant
to life
to life
in the universe
and everything.
and everything.
Sorry for the Douglas Adams reference.
Okay, second one is internal logical consistency. And that's sort of along the same lines as non-contradiction, that the essential elements of any worldview must agree, be in accord with one another without contradiction. I don't know if you want to give an example of that or just keep moving on. Okay, so the third one is coherence. That it's along the lines of consistency, that there's internal logical consistency, but it's also takes it a little bit of a step further, and the central propositions must be related to one another. So they must make a coherent logical progression, and they must be interconnected conceptually. The fourth one is that it inspires culture, and that's when a worldview actually fits with reality, it should motivate its followers, okay? And it should motivate its followers in a specific way. To embrace that reality with confidence and energy, that means it's intellectual discovery, creativity, and productivity. And so it must inspire culture. That's one of the requirements for the criteria for the evaluation of a worldview. The fifth one is factual adequacy. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want to sort of jump in on these?
Yeah, just factual adequacy means that it has to be able to agree with the observable reality. It has to correspond with our experience and be able to predict and then prove out against the world and our experience with it.
The next one is existential viability. Who here has heard the terminology, it's an existential crisis? What does that mean? No idea? Okay. What's an existential crisis? It means you don't know what your meaning is, your purpose is, why are you here? What should you be doing? It is related to the meaning and the purpose that you would have. And so a worldview actually must address both meaning and purpose. And meaning and purpose for life without jumping over or without skipping essential elements to life. Radical ad hoc adjustment is 7. That means that when faced with potentially defeating counter evidence, that it doesn't just
Rewrite
the core tenets of what it is.
And there are religions and worldviews that when something popped up that they couldn't explain or that contradicted some of their claims, they just reinvented the rules and reinvented the fundamentals along the way. And it's a huge red flag that there's a problem with this as a worldview or as a religion because they're too willing to abandon previously held core beliefs and adopt new ones in order to maintain relevancy and to match with reality. So it's a huge red flag.
And we have to be really aware of something. There can be times where further investigation happens, and so it reveals more of the truth or it reveals a different interpretation or preference. But the core tenets, the main pieces of that worldview, cannot just be randomly changed for convenience. And then Occam's razor.
The last one's Occam's razor, which we only put up there because we were running out of room on the slide. People don't necessarily know what Occam's razor is, and so we're going to define it for you. but it's the idea that simpler explanations are preferable to unnecessarily complicated ones. You see why that didn't fit on the slide? Okay, but Occam's razor, Occam was a philosopher, believe it or not, who said that given all other things being equal, if there are two explanations for a given thing, the one that is simpler and is less complicated is preferential. So there's a bunch of important concepts there. All other things being equal, meaning both of these things equally explain what we know. If one of them is more complicated and one of them is simpler, the simpler is the preferential option.
Okay, so these are the 8 criteria upon which a worldview is going to be evaluated. And we aren't going to evaluate every single worldview throughout this class, but we will take you through a couple of them toward the end, after we've gotten through a lot of this, so that you can see, as we build the case for Christianity, that you can see why it is more reasonable, more logical, and meets the criteria, those 8 criteria, in a more profound way than any other worldview.
By pointing out the ways and areas that some of the other worldviews fail in some of these fundamental requirements.
Yeah.
Where do these evaluation of worldviews, this criteria, where does it come from? Not that I disagree with it.
Yeah.
It makes sense, but if you...
That's a good question. Where do these 8 criteria come from? George said it earlier, in the world of engineering and science, a fact is, and then he went, and he listed out all these things. And so in the world of science, technology, and study, and those things applied, engineering, physics, there are these fundamental operating principles that we accept as good science, good exploration, good engineering, good technology, right? And what it took was philosophers to be like, okay, so why is this engineering technique acceptable and leads to good engineering and solid bridges that we can count on, and this engineering technique not? Right? Why? Because it was missing some of these things. And so where this came from is philosophers, people who were paid to sit around.
Sitters. Philosophers are sitters, folks.
Maybe I should stand up.
Yeah.
Paid to sit around and piece these things, or tear these things apart and then piece them back together in what the fundamental components are. And you will find other explanations from other philosophers that are advancing a different way to tear this apart, and they'll debate amongst themselves about what the pieces are and whether or not there should be a 9th criteria, or whether or not one of those 8 should be dropped off and we should just use 7, right? But modern philosophical evaluations agree for the most part on these. And you can always go deeper, you can always go further, but these are the ones that are generally accepted. Is that enough of an explanation? Okay.
Okay. Again, wanted to give you a little bit of that basis. If you want to get into some of the depths of that kind of philosophy, we do have a couple of books we would recommend. So let us know, and we'll point you in the right direction. But now let's get into the meat, the heart of what we're trying to explore tonight. And that is the existence of God. And so at the very beginning, we asked the question, do you believe there is evidence for God? And we believe that there is evidence for God. Well, in order to prove the existence of God, we have to explore that evidence and those proofs, those things that we can see, can port with reality, that are also experiential. It's really interesting when you read different explanations of apologetics. Some of them lean heavier on the experiential. Some of them lean heavier on the verifiable fact and objective truth. Both of those are valid, but you have to explore the evidence. Here's the key thing about this. Based on truth, fact, knowledge, and faith, Once you've explored the evidence, then you have to be willing to adjust your life accordingly. So there's actually a whole section in a chapter we were reading, and it was, what if I just don't want to believe? And ultimately, that's a choice. But if you explore the evidence that we're going to do over the next many weeks, and you come to the reasonable understanding, knowledge, and agree with all of the evidence and proof that we have laid out over the course of the next couple of months, then the next step is that you have to be willing to adjust your life accordingly. Anything you want to add to that?
It reminds me of the season that we're in right now with politics, that we spend a lot of time, debating with people and showing lines of evidence and trying to convince one side or the other that our view is more reasonable and deserving of a vote than the others. It's a similar concept, except vastly more important than an election, okay? That when we look at all of the evidence and when we open ourselves up to the possibility of something being true that we hadn't previously acknowledged or been receptive to, are we willing to let the evidence convince us and change our mind? And so this is ultimately about people coming to faith, and this is about salvation, the ultimate important question. And so anybody who has a story of coming to faith, anyone who has a story about their testimony, that what they're telling you in their way is their accumulation of truth, fact, knowledge that ultimately leads to their faith. And some people it's based mostly on experience, some people it's based mostly on evidence, some people it's based mostly on an intellectual assent. But whatever that person's story is in their testimony, that is their story of how they came to be able to make the decision that this is something that they believe in and are willing to step out in faith on.
So ultimately, there are a couple of sides to that. Experiential, evidence-based, all of those are valid in the pursuit of the understanding of the existence of God. Now, before we get into that exact proof, wanted to actually talk about three main areas quickly that are in opposition to God and God's existence. And so we talked a little bit about relative truth, right? So this is the concept of relativism, that all truth is relative. Meaning what's true for me is not true for you, what's true for you is not true for me. And we'll get into that a little bit, but inherently that has a completely contradictory internal logic. So it actually just failed the criteria for philosophical evaluation. Okay? The second one is naturalism. Everything came from natural causes. Now, that has to then exclude the supernatural. So you cannot invoke God or any kind of supernatural reason for things. And the belief is that everything came from nature. There are natural causes for everything. And we'll get into a little bit of why that is less valid, that is invalid. And then the third one is simply atheism, disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. So theism or pluralism or monotheism, all of those. So it's just that God does not exist at all. And so we're going to start to attack all of this in a few different ways and start to prove that there is evidence for God. And ultimately, what we are, we're creating this evidence, and we're basing it on what we know, what's verifiable, what is truth. But what we're not trying to do tonight is to say that the Judeo-Christian God is the real God. That's actually not what we're doing here tonight. What
We'll get
we are,
there.
we'll get there. But what we are doing is saying that it is more reasonable that God exists. And we're going to look at three different areas: the evidence of morality, the evidence of cosmology, and the evidence of design, or what's also called fine-tuning of the universe. And so
And that's just three
That's
of
just three.
a bunch. There's about a dozen. So you can go a lot further. And other people will say, well, what about that? Yeah, we can talk about those too, because people have their pet favorite evidences for God. But we're going to talk about just these three.
And these are the three
Big ones.
major ones.
Yeah.
These are the three major ones. And so we want to hit these three, and then, like I said, if you ever want to get further into it, we can certainly do that. But the first one is morality. Okay, so what do we mean by morality? It's appealing to a behavior or an agreed upon code that you expect others to know about. And then there are a couple of other pieces to this. It's a concept of just or unjust. And the concept of just or unjust doesn't even make sense unless there is something to compare it against. And then the fact that we are hardwired with a sense of right or wrong. Okay, so appealing to some kind of behavior that we expect others to know about. If you were in line at Disneyland and you had been waiting for
4 hours.
4 hours to get on the new Star Wars ride, and somebody came along through the exit, ran in, and cut in front of you, what would be your reaction to that? Disgust. We all know cutting in line is wrong.
Ask a first grader.
And
Ask a first grader,
and we
right?
expect people to know that
We
without
expect
having
people
to
to know
define
that.
it, right? That this is unjust.
Mm-hmm.
So there is just, waiting your turn in line, and there is unjust, which is disregarding the people who have done what they're supposed to do, and you're cheating.
And here's something that people will say that that's something you learned over the course of time. I completely disagree with that. Take toddlers. Toddlers have an innate sense of justice. They're also very selfish, but they have an innate sense of justice. You took my toy. That's not right. That wasn't yours.
It's my turn on the swing. Why are there turns?
Who said that there were turns? Why do we know this? Okay. There are things that we as a culture, as a society, and objectively we agree on. It is wrong to hurt innocent people. It's wrong to have racial inequality. It is wrong to destroy the environment, et cetera, right? These are things that we appeal to everybody as they should know. Okay?
All right, so what do you do with the objection from relativism where someone says, okay, so you're transported into this other culture, you and your sister, and in this culture, as soon as you arrive in town, your sister gets trussed up on a spit and roasted over the fire so that the entire village can enjoy. Are you going to say, well, that's just their truth, and you're going to partake with them in this act of cannibalism because it is what is right for them? What do you do with that? I was really asking you.
Oh. Well, I would have, you don't want to know what I would have done. But I agree that would be wrong.
Let me write that one down.
Write that one down. Check mark. Killing people is wrong by roasting them on a spit and then eating them as your village. Beth.
So, you got the two toddlers,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them had the toy taken away.
Mm-hmm.
And the one that took the toy
Mm-hmm.
was their justice.
Okay, so what you're trying to say is that the toddler who came in and took the toy, and the appeal to the objective standard is that was wrong for you to just take the toy. There are consequences to the thing that was wrong. But the appeal, the objective standard, is that that was wrong to take something that does not belong to you. Now, they might have taken it because they wanted it. They might have taken it because they thought it was their turn. So they have their own sense of justice. The point is not who took the toy and the other person wanted the toy. The point is, where did that sense of justice even come from? Okay? So when we're talking about relativistic morality, we're talking about what one person believes is true is not the truth for the other person. And philosophically and very, very practically, just as that example states, that just doesn't make sense. Because even those who are relativistic moralists, the worst that they could say, the most that they could say is that the greatest objection that they could have is that they just don't happen to agree with that.
And that's why we take it to this illogical example of cannibalism and roasting someone over a spit is, I'm sorry, if that was my family member that was being killed and roasted over a spit over someone else's preferences, I can't just say, well, I just don't agree with this right now. Okay? This whole concept of moral relativism fails on the face of it when you take it to its illogical conclusion. When you take it as far as you could possibly take it, you see that it fails. Because there is a larger appeal to moral justice that we're all ingrained. We're all hardwired with it. We all have this sense of justice. Now, back to your example with the toddlers, right? The one who took the toy, right? It gets real for them when the tables are flipped and something gets taken from them. Now suddenly they understand and they have experienced the other side of the coin, having something taken unjustly from them. And now the appeal to higher culture is imagine what it would be like for you if the thing that you did to them were to happen to you. Would you want that to happen? That's that sense of justice.
So are you saying that we're born with this
Yes,
knowledge?
we are hardwired with justice.
Or it's a learned?
Okay, so that's the next one, because we're going to talk about that, because that's called evolutionary morality. Okay, but I believe that we are hardwired with a sense of justice. We are hardwired with a sense of morality, of what is right and what is wrong. And I'm going to get to something in just a second. But there is the concept that morality is only evolutionary. It's just something that we've learned over time because it was taught to us. And are there things that we believe because it's the tradition that we understand? Yes. But when it comes to morality in terms of evolutionary morality, the concept is that we want our genes to carry on through our children, and so this concept of reciprocal altruism.
So what do we mean? We're talking about behavior that ultimately leads to the success of your future genes. So it may be a behavior that's hardwired into you and you don't know where it comes from, and you have this tendency to make these decisions, right? So is this an explanation for why we give selflessly, right? So there's this concept in evolutionary altruism. Altruism means you're doing something good for other people, right? So that concept of the evolutionary is, we're hardwired to make sure that our genes succeed, right? So does that explain why we sometimes do nice things for other people? That's the question for the evolutionary side.
And ultimately, it can't, because if that were, and I'll get to you in just 1 second, if that were the case, and you were acting out of reciprocal altruism and it was about a selfish desire, it actually becomes very counterproductive, and it becomes unexplainable because we hold societally, culturally, morally, that laying down your life for somebody else is a heroic act. That flies in the face of evolutionary morality, because you wouldn't do that. So if we only got our morality based on what we learned from an evolutionary perspective with the desire to have our genes reproduce, That actually is now in contradiction, because what we would have done is we would have wiped out every other tribe that we saw unfit, and that is actually
threat.
where people took it. There was such a thing as eugenics that was very common in the 1920s and 30s, and that's actually
America.
and in Europe too. There were many different eugenics conferences that happened around the world, and it was that you want the fittest to survive, and so that means anybody who had a mental or physical disability or handicap, you should simply exclude them from the gene pool.
By forcible sterilization. Okay, so we've jumped over a bunch of questions. I saw Sean and I saw
But
Tina.
Tina,
I was just thinking, what sprang to mind was Lot's daughters.
mm-hmm.
Because they were thinking, we have to preserve the line, let's get dad drunk and sleep with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so wrong and messed up, you know? But yet, that's what they were thinking. They were thinking, we gotta preserve the line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and that didn't work out very well for them. So evolutionarily, that should have told people don't do that, right? So we didn't get our morality simply from our sense of designing, wanting to have our genes survive, but morality had to come from somewhere. Sean,
I got a few things to say, sorry.
no, go for it.
Remember to speak up to the mic so the recording can hear you.
Number one, I've discovered that it's an objective truth that if you show up when the park opens and beeline it over the Rise of the Resistance, you won't be in line for 2 hours,
That's true.
20 minutes.
Yep. The other way to do that is called a lightning lane, and you pay for that.
Okay,
Yep,
so,
second one.
Y'all a bunch of Disney geeks, I swear.
Y'all have no idea. I'm just saying.
Miss Beth's example.
Yeah.
There's a bit of a darker side to that, but we like to skip over that. The toddler who took the other toddler's toy may also still have that sense of justice of right and wrong and simply not care that it's wrong.
That's absolutely true. Somebody can simply.
For toddlers, but for
Yep.
us as adults, it extends to much worse things.
You're right. You're right.
There's a darker side to that.
But there's
Darker
still
side,
an
but-
understanding
but
of
I'm-
right and wrong.
I'm going to push back there and say that we characterize someone who is wired that way, that is a defect. That is a defect in a personality or a defect in the brain chemistry. Those things happen. There are people who are true is it sociopaths?
Sociopaths and psychopaths are
True
two different things, but
sociopaths and
sociopaths don't
psychopaths,
know.
right? One doesn't know the difference between right and wrong,
And one knows and doesn't
just
care.
simply is incapable of caring. Both of those are defined and fortunately fairly rare defects in someone's
Good
wiring.
point.
Well, I also think it's a product of our sinful nature. I mean, there's
Absolutely.
there's
Absolutely.
much of our sin is quite willful.
That's fair. That's fair.
Knowledge.
There's a lot of willful
We
sin.
have that
That's fair.
knowledge of justice, and we all, regardless of the knowledge, we choose the wrong end.
It's a good
But
point.
also, there's you're a really extreme and dark example of eating your sister.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you'll talk about this more, but we also have, because I've encountered this among people, that it goes back to the relativistic morality that we talk about, and one might argue that in the eyes of the tribe, who say maybe they're starving, killing and eating your sister, who's not even one of their number, might save the lives of 10 of them for a week, and they might consider that a moral positive, you know what I'm saying?
On
Yeah.
balance, it's on the scale.
Yeah,
It's
and
not that you would kill and eat this one person so 10 people can live.
Yep.
You know, and sci-fi TV shows go, explore that all the time.
yeah, there was actually a Harvard study that was done on this. And the Harvard study was done that said if there was somebody that you could kill them and that would feed 5 starving people, or I'm not sure if it was starving people, I don't remember the specifics of it, but ultimately it was in the overwhelming vast majority of society, it was not morally right to kill somebody even in order to save 5 or 10 or 20 other people, right?
Yeah,
Now,
and it was a two-part study.
and it was a two-part study,
One,
yes.
one of them is the switching to the train track moral dilemma, where you have a train that's hurtling towards a station which has 20 people in it, and when the train crashes, some of those people are probably going to die, but you don't know. Or you can switch the train over to the other track, and it is guaranteed that one person will die. Which choice do you make? And society overwhelmingly rejects the choice.
Yeah. Not that they even made the choice, they reject the choice. And so all of this, the reason that we talk about the evidence of morality is, where does morality come from? Really, that's the basis of why we're having this discussion. Morality, if there is an objective standard, who created the objective standard? Okay, so let's get into that. Where does morality come from?
Oh, I think Sean wanted to say
Oh.
something.
Yeah, I didn't want to leave it at that. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I don't want you to think that I was actually arguing in favor of beating people.
Yeah, no.
We're coming back to that.
I'm just saying that.
We're actually coming back to
you
that.
have poke a hole in that, and that it can be skewed, and there must be a source of, it's absolutely wrong to kill animals, even if it
Yep.
might mean other people might starve.
Right, and
Yep.
we're about to go
You
there.
have to discover, I guess, there are certain ways of thinking that, back to the fact that, and
Are
don't.
fundamentally flawed.
That are fundamentally flawed. And I have a great quote for you in 2 slides because it's absolutely true. But to your point, Diane, we find that in Scripture, that Paul actually talks about this. This is Romans 2:14 through 15, and he says, even Gentiles. Now you got to remember, Gentiles were not.
They're pagans.
They were pagans.
They were we talk about Judeo-Christian beliefs, right? Well, before you had Christian, there was Judeo, so the Judeo God. So that whole system of God's morals and values, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, those values, right? So we talk about Judeo-Christian values. Then there was the pagans, everyone else, people who had these wild and crazy views on the world, right? So that's the context behind saying, even the Gentiles, even the pagans, even the ones who were
Even those
sacrificing,
heathens.
even those heathens,
They who do not have God's written law show that they know this law, his law, when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them they're doing right. So it makes what I want to get to here is that it makes the most rational sense that there is an objective measure of morality.
and it's imprinted on all of our minds or hearts.
And so that means you have to ask the question,
Where did it come from?
where did that come from? There is an innate understanding. And this part of the Bible, this actually rings really true. And it aligns not only biblically, but experientially for us as well. So, what happens when you have conflicting moral constructs? When you have vice and virtue? I love this quote. Why do cultures and human beings disagree with one another on what is vice and virtue at times? Why does a village believe in eating people if that is objectively wrong? Because, like mathematics, people sometimes get their answers wrong, but that doesn't mean the multiplication table isn't right or doesn't exist.
So people come up with the wrong, this is to answer Sean's question. People come up with the wrong answer, and they've made some mistake in applying the rules. Because objectively, there is a truth, and they've missed it. And when you take that to its logical, illogical extreme, you wind up killing and eating your friends and neighbors.
You have an opinion that it doesn't make it fact.
Okay.
Okay, let's get into some. So that was that was probably one of the more
Heady.
yeah, just it's more philosophical. Most people understand that there's a right and wrong, and the main point of the evidence of morality is, where does that sense of right and wrong come from? It doesn't come from evolution. We're able to prove that. It isn't relativistic, because that is contradictory just in
On
and
the
of
face of
itself. So it has to have come from somewhere. So that's the first evidence for God. The second evidence that we're going to talk about tonight is cosmology. And so cosmology is the evidence that comes from the stars above us. Okay, this is what comes from the heavens. And there are three things: scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. That's one of the pieces of evidence. And it is widely accepted that all galaxies, stars, planets, energy, and matter have a common point of origin. And the Big Bang explanation is now accepted in all major fields of science. That wasn't always true.
So going back to before the 1920s, we said, okay, where did everything come from? The common explanation that flies in the face of, that is contradictory to Christianity, is that the thing that always existed was the universe itself. That the universe had no beginning, it was just eternal in and of itself, and that it explains itself. It just is. Okay? So then, in the 1920s, what happened? Who knows what happened in the 1920s? Hubble. You know,
Who's heard of the Hubble telescope?
Who's heard of the Hubble telescope?
Okay. Most powerful telescope ever to that point.
So the reason the Hubble telescope is called the Hubble telescope is it was named after this guy, Edwin Hubble, who spent a lot of time staring at the stars through a giant telescope in the 1920s. Okay? And he made some pretty incredible observations that when he figured out what they meant, he proposed them, and the entire atheistic scientific community rejected them because it implied that there was an origin to the universe and that the universe had not been eternal. Okay? So let's get into what that evidence is.
Okay. So Edwin Hubble looks through his telescope. He's looking at it over the course of the time. This is considered probably one of the greatest scientific discoveries of the 20th century. And it took a long, long time to prove it because, just as you said, the scientific community actually rejected it out of hand. But he discovered that galaxies were moving away from each other. So they were departing, they were moving away, and the thing that was actually growing was space itself. And then there was a lot more that went into it. There was further scientific study, and it concluded that the galaxies were moving apart from each other because they were flung apart.
They were decelerating. They had started faster and were flying apart, but they were getting slower as they went.
Which meant if they got slower, that means they had to have a point of origin that
Right.
started at a certain speed. And as they got slower and slower and slower, what that means is
They're not accelerating away from each other. There's
Yeah.
not something that's driving them apart. It's that they originated all at the same point and were flung out from the same point, and they're decelerating.
And so modern science, modern cosmology, it actually confirms what Hubble proposed, what he deduced as what he was looking at, is that the stars, the planets, matter, everything, energy, had a common point of origin. And they figure it was approximately 15 billion years ago, which really is irrelevant. And that was when all of the mass in the universe was compressed into a single atom, smaller than an
into a
atom.
space smaller than the size
into
of
a
the
space
single
smaller
atom.
than that of a single atom, and that they exploded into being. And science proves it. So the Big Bang theory, or the Big Bang explanation, is now accepted in every single major field of study.
Because of all the evidence.
Because of all of the evidence. It has been proven further and further and further by science. And so since that time of Hubble's initial discovery, it took time. There was a lot of observable evidence that was brought forward. There was a lot of verification.
Okay. So why does that mean?
Why does it even matter?
Why does it
Yeah.
matter, and why does this mean that this is evidence for God? Keep going.
Because it means that we know that there was a beginning to the universe.
And that's the cosmological argument.
And that's the cosmological argument. So, which takes us to the concept of what's called contingency. And contingency is fully accepted concept in both science and philosophy. And here's the interesting thing, it's accepted by both atheists and theists. Here's what it says. If something begins to exist, its existence is dependent on something outside of it that pre-existed it, causing it to come into being.
That's why it was so important that they said the universe is the thing that has always existed and nothing caused it to come into existence. That was the held belief by physicists and scientists and cosmologists for a long time, hundreds of years. And that's why this evidence that, no, everything in the universe came from a single point and then all exploded from a single point. That means it all came from one thing. It all came from that means it had an origin. And that origin had to have been from outside of something in the universe.
And the reason it has to have a beginning is because as it goes through the deceleration process, eventually it will stop moving. If it could stop moving, it had to have a start.
If it has an end.
If it has an end, it has a beginning, right? And then the second piece to that is that, so that it's dependent on something outside of it that pre-existed it, causing it to come into being, and everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. That's the concept of contingency. That is a completely accepted concept. And so, you as a person, you didn't just magically come into being. There was something that caused you
To begin to exist.
And if you don't know how that happens, this is not that class. We'll tell you about that later. But you had to have something that created you based on something that pre-existed you. Okay? So that's why this is really important. So if there's proven evidence for the beginning of the universe, it means that there stands to reason that it has to have a cause. The universe has to have a cause. So
did Hubble, did his discovery give some support to the Big Bang Theory?
his discovery was
the
big.
Yeah, the question was, did Hubble's discovery contribute to the Big Bang Theory? Hubble's discovery was the basis of the Big Bang Theory.
And we got a great one from Stephen
It
Hawking.
also proved that the Earth didn't, the world, whatever you want, didn't always exist.
Right.
That's right. That's right. Because it all started from a single point. So if it had always existed, the movement away and from each other, it would have remained consistent.
It would have remained constant.
It would have remained constant. And because it isn't constant, because it is decelerating, it had to have a starting point and an ending point.
And if you want to know what that evidence was, if you may have heard the term of the redshift in astrophysics, the redshift. The redshift is the explanation behind the observation that things are decelerating. And we can talk about that offline, but for those of you who have heard and what evidence that we're talking about, it's the redshift of light.
So did the Hubble telescope prove?
No, the Hubble telescope was an homage to Edwin Hubble. It was actually launched long after his death, but they named it after him because of the significance of his work staring through a telescope. So they're like, okay, so now we're going to make the best telescope ever created and put it in space where it doesn't have to deal with the atmosphere. So it's a satellite telescope. What are we going to call it? We're going to call it Hubble because we're naming it after this guy. So no, his observation was actually on whatever the name of that mountain is in LA, where he was staring through a 100-millimeter telescope, which is not that big. 100 millimeters, only 3 feet, right? And so the Hubble telescope is meters across. So anyway, no, it wasn't the Hubble telescope itself. It was Hubble's work before his telescope that was named after him.
Okay, so the point here is that if we can prove, and it's been proven, that the universe came into existence, that means it had to have had a cause. So what is its cause? It must have pre-existed matter, which means that we're talking about the mind. And God is spirit, so he is mind. So there's another piece to this, and it's called the Kalam cosmological argument. And it says this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And so if we really kind of go back and think about that, what we're really talking about is that the evidence points to a cosmic creator, something that had to exist before the universe existed. Okay? There's actually, this was interesting. The argument against this is called the nothing hypothesis.
Oh,
That's actually the name of it. It is as absurd as it sounds. This is what it is. What caused the Big Bang? Nothing.
did the Big Bang happen?
Yes.
What caused the Big Bang?
Nothing. It just happened.
It just happened.
Now, that doesn't work scientifically. It doesn't work practically. It doesn't work logically. It doesn't work philosophically or even experientially.
I mean,
So
try it. Try it. Are you pregnant? Yes. Was there a cause for that? No. Are you still pregnant? Yes. What caused it? Nothing.
Oh, yeah, there's books about that. It's called fiction.
Right.
it's called fiction. Except for, and even if we're going to talk about, biblically, we're going to talk about Mary. What was the cause? The Holy Spirit. It was God. There was a cause. Okay. So that was, the example kind of for this is if you were in a room and the windows were closed, you walked out and you walked back in and the windows were open, but nobody else, but you didn't know if anybody else had been in the room, what would be your conclusion?
Somebody opened the window.
Somebody opened the window. It's not nothing. It just happened. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And so that's really what we're talking about here. So this is Francis Collins, who was the scientist who mapped the human genome. And he has this amazing quote, and it says, "The Big Bang cries out for a divine explanation. It forces the conclusion that nature had a defined beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only a supernatural force that is outside space and time could have done that." So really, what are we talking about? A transcendent mind that created all things starting from a single point. And we see this exemplified biblically, right when we look at Genesis 1. Genesis 1, 1 through 3. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." So the evidence is that the universe came into existence. It had a beginning. It was from a single point and flung apart. And that's what we are given as the example biblically as well, that God created with the universe, starting with the light and moving it from there. Okay. Any questions?
Didn't you include the quote from Stephen Hawking?
That would be in
Oh,
here.
later. I'm jumping the gun. Sorry. Okay.
You're jumping ahead,
All right.
and yes, I did. Thank you very much. Let's move on to design.
Okay.
This
Who
is
am I-
Christopher's absolute favorite, so I'm going to kind of let you take over here.
So not only does astronomy, when we look at the scope of evidence for God, you can use two different scopes. You can use the telescope, like Hubble did, and you can use the microscope, right? So both of them, when you look extremely large or you look extremely small, you see evidence for God in both in terms of his design, in terms of his balance, in terms of him sustaining existence. The evidence is there. So back to the verse from Romans, it says, the evidence is clear. It's there in creation for people to see if you'll just see it, right? So this is one of my other favorite examples, because every time, I think we quoted it last time, and I'll say it again. There's a quote from Heisenberg which is a nuclear physicist, and he says, the first gulp from the natural sciences will leave you an atheist, right? So as we start to look at the natural sciences and we look at explanations, we're like, look, we can explain everything that happened, right?
There's no need to explain about
There's
God.
no need to invoke God. There's no need to appeal to God. But then the rest of the Heisenberg quote is, the first gulp from natural science will leave you an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, you find God waiting for you. And so what I have found in my study, in my journey through the sciences, is that the more and more you study the universe, the more you reveal about how God worked. And you wind up seeing this incredibly building body of knowledge and evidence that all points to God. And so we looked at the evidence in the universe, and we're going to look at it more in terms of the existence of the universe. But then when we also look specifically at life in biology, we see incredible evidence. And we're going to go back to Francis Collins and what he said. So in one strand of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid being the one unifying molecule of life, all life uses DNA as its information system for replication and continuing, right? So one strand of DNA from a single-celled organism, so just take like an amoeba, right? That one organism, it has information packed into its nuclear information, its nucleus, and it's enough information to fill 30 encyclopedias of information. It's that much information tightly packed. And that information is not random, but it conveys incredible amounts of information. And that information is structured. Keep going. So Francis Collins, the guy who mapped the genome, okay, when he started that project, he was actually an atheist, okay? And he didn't believe that there was a designer. But what he found as he studied science, through his application of science, the nuclear information, the information of life, was that it was a code. And so after they did the mapping project, he was a millionaire at this point because he licensed his technology. And so he was spending his time volunteering with organizations. And interestingly, he actually spent some time with I just blanked on the term. It's the Intelligent Design Institute in Seattle. And he came to the director of the Intelligent Design Institute. He said, what's incredible about the information that we see coded is that in DNA, not only do we have a simple, straightforward book of information, but you see information layered inside information. There's multiple reading frames. That would be like if you're reading a book. If you begin at the first letter and start reading in chunks, you wind up with words. But if you start on the second letter and start reading, there's still words, and they all make sense. And then if you start on the third letter and keep reading, there's still words, and they all make sense. It's nested in layers of information, meaning that the amount of information that's packed into this piece of data is actually more information than just the data would imply. And then there's also interactions where that data interacts with other pieces of data and changes the signal, and it modulates the signal. So it's almost like a pick your own adventure story where depending on where you start and where you jump to, you wind up with different results and different conclusions. And what Francis Collins came back to is he went back to the director of the Intelligent Design. He says, wherever you see information, there's this implication of intelligence, okay? That we know that, right? When you find a chunk of information, you say that information had to have come from somewhere. He says, but what we see as an even more elegant proof of intelligence is when you have layers of organized information. He said the only other place that we see this strategy of layering information in the data is with advanced coding. And the best advanced coders that we have today can't do anything near as sophisticated as what we see in the code of life in DNA. And that's why Francis Collins is now talking about God. is he was an atheist, and his study of DNA and how it works, he goes, there's no other explanation. There has to be an intelligent designer of this information. And not only is this designer intelligent, the intelligence is beyond anything that we can even conceive of. Not that we might be capable of it someday. It is beyond what we are even capable of understanding. They are today, as they continue to unpack what's going on in the genome, and we're still discovering things like, we didn't know that was going on 40 years ago when we were first looking at this. Look, there's this whole really important concept of what's going on with the genome, and we didn't even know about it. There's new layers of complexity that are being discovered and explored even today that show the incredible intelligence that went into the design of the molecules of life. Sean.
I just wanted to recommend, if anybody hadn't seen it yet, years ago, Ben Stein made a documentary, No Intelligence Allowed. You may have seen it. He explores he's not arguing for God in the documentary. What he's showing is the hostility
Against
the idea
intelligence.
of intelligent design or creator in the scientific community.
Yes.
And how it influences their conclusions. And very simplified version of what you just said, but even one of the scientists that he interviews quotes that any successful scientist approaches science, and the scientific method starts with a theory, approaches it with a design perspective, and then once they make their discoveries and do their conclusion, they just reject the design part of it.
Yeah.
And that,
Okay, so that was the very small micro. Now let's go back to the universe, because there's another incredible piece of evidence, right? So we talked about cosmology. Now let's talk about the rules for existence, okay? The rules on which the universe spins, because these are incredible. And what it points to is what's called an anthropic principle, meaning that there was someone or something that set the rules in place, right? So the universe, Big Bang, the universe popped into existence, right? But that means that someone or something outside of existence reached in and established the playing rules, established the ground rules for how things were going to work, okay? Keep going. So, and there's layers to this one. In fact, there's like 140 layers to this one. We're not going to get into all of them. But one of the first ones is that when you go back and look at the Big Bang, okay, as things were banging in the first fractions of a microsecond after the Big Bang banged, if the rate of acceleration of matter and energy were any smaller than what it actually was, all of that matter of energy would have gone right back together. Okay? Similarly, if the rate of that acceleration of the Big Bang banging was any greater than what it was, then all of matter would have spread out equally in the universe, and you would have no coalescence of stars, no coalescence of matter, nothing other than simple hydrogen would exist. There would be no other elements, because nothing could have ever gotten together in any meaningful way. So, what are the chances that the Big Bang banged at the exact right speed for matter to exist in a state in the universe where life could exist?
So let's do the math. This is also called the fine-tuning, and it's considered the design, the fine-tuning of the universe is considered probably one of the most powerful arguments for the existence of God.
Okay?
But let's do the math here.
So the chances of the universe doing that is 1 chance in 10 to the 138th power. Okay? That's a weird number. Some of us who have a scientific background or we're used to working with exponents, you're like, okay, what's the big deal of 10 to 138th power? Well, let's put some context to this, right? Our best guess for the entire duration of the universe existing, that 15 billion years, is 10 to the 17th seconds. The entire history of the universe is only 10 to the 17th. So that's 15 billion years, right? So if we say you have a 1 in 15 billion chance, are you buying that lottery ticket? No, okay? Well, that would only be 1 times 10 to the 17th. We said the chances are 1 times 10 to the 138th, right? That's literally 120 more orders of magnitude less likely, okay? Let's give another one. 10 to the 70th, all right? Now we're halfway there, right? That is our best estimate of the total number of atoms existing in the universe. So it's like saying pick a random atom in the universe, and you have a better chance of picking a random atom in the universe successfully than for the universe to have sprung into existence at the exact right speed for all of matter to exist. You guys getting, this is balanced on a razor's edge, except that the razor is infinitely sharp, okay? But wait, there's more. Okay? There are approximately 122 variables about how nature works, how physics works, how existence works, okay? What are we talking about? One is, for example, the speed of light, okay? Another one is, for example, the weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force that govern particle physics. Another one is like Planck's constant. So these are concepts in science, right? Now we know speed of light. Speed of light's pretty fast, right? What's the number for the speed of light? What is it? Something 10 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. Miles.
6,000
Miles a second, and then convert that to meters, and you wind up with a nice round 10. So it's like 10 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. So it's a fairly large value, okay? And then you also can go on the small scale. So Planck's constant, for example, which is one of the principles that influences how atoms are held together, is, if I remember correctly, it's like 1.47 times 10 to the minus 28th, right? So 10 to the minus 28th. Again, we're in exponents, but that means that you have 28 zeros. You have a decimal point, then you have 28 zeros before you even get to a measurable quantity. It's this incredibly small quantity. And yet, if the speed of light were anything other than what it is, or Planck's constant were anything other than what it is, and then there's 120 other variables, matter wouldn't exist the way it does. Okay, so somebody set all of these values in place. Here's where it gets creepier. Those values don't influence each other. When you set Planck's value at 1.47 times 10 to the minus 20th, I'm not getting that number right, but I'm in the neighborhood, right? When you set, that doesn't mean that Planck's constant now means that the speed of light must equal this. They are completely independent and spread across hundreds of orders of magnitude from each other. So the chances that the rules of existence would be such that life can exist is so infinitesimally small that it is right next to impossible. That's called the fine-tuning of the universe. The rules for existence were put in place the way they are so that we could be here. That's the conclusion. Go ahead.
So these chances are so low that mathematicians cry out for an explanation. What this means is just that it's a statistical impossibility for
That it's random.
for this to have happened or that it is random. It has to have a cause. It has to have an intelligent designer. It has to have been intentional. So I love this. This quote is from Stephen Hawking. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million millionths, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size into a hot fireball. The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are religious implications.
That's Stephen Hawking. So
that is, we've just gone through sort of the basis for philosophical debate of worldviews. We've talked a little bit about how you can judge a worldview against these different criteria. We only got into a couple of pieces in terms of worldview. And like I said, we'll get to some of those later. And then we went into 3 different arguments, of which there's even more. But these are the 3 major evidences for the existence of God. And the fine-tuning of the universe really is probably the most
Mathematically compelling.
mathematically compelling, influential. It is the greatest evidence for the existence of God, because you just can't argue with it. It is objective truth.
So we just hit you guys with an awful lot of information, a lot of big concepts to think about. Do you have any questions, concerns?
Is some of that information that you guys talked about in that Mark Clark book?
Yes.
Some of it is, yes.
Some of it. About half to
About
two-thirds.
half of it. But you have to understand that he's referencing a lot of other materials as well. So he's referencing Grutyse, he's referencing William Lane Craig, he's referencing, so a lot of these, Alvin Plantinga is a favorite of his, Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher.
And the reason I'm laughing is because, like, in the first chapter, one of the suggested reading in the first chapter is go read this other textbook by Grutyse.
No, that was the other one that was the
Okay.
other one.
Grutyse is 1,200 pages long and has like 47 chapters.
So if you really want to get into it,
as
it's considered kind of the culmination of
Yeah.
all things in relation to the argument for the existence of God, and then ultimately for the reasonableness, the most reasonableness for
just cracked me
Christianity.
up. For additional context, go see this 1,200-page textbook.
Yes. We both went,
That's funny. Because we have that.
because we have that textbook. Anyway, yeah.
Is Stephen Hawking, as far as we know, still dying atheist, as far as we know, or do we know?
I don't know.
I don't think we know.
I don't know. Sean?
Before I make my comment, I want to jump ahead of you guys. Are you guys going to talk about how the prevalence of faith later on in this discussion?
Oh, how we're wired to believe in something?
Or even how much we do take on faith,
Uh,
we don't realize we do?
It's an interesting question. It wasn't one that we were going to go into intentionally.
Well, the only reason I'm saying is because, like, I once came across a math, obviously not nearly as complicated as math you guys are talking about, but one mathematician calculated the expansion of just human population.
Mm-hmm.
And just the mathematical conclusion is like he calculated down everybody in existence comes down to one ancestor, not even that long ago, like 10,000 years ago or something like that. And I was having this discussion with a guy that I work with, and he says, "Well, I don't think that's true." That's not true.
Absolutely.
These are great facts and stuff we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yep.
You can talk over defending the faith, but a lot of times it comes down, in my experience, it comes down to, no, that's not true. You know,
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much out there that we don't have time to get into all of it in just a 12 or 13 week study. But what Sean is talking about is, it's in the stuff we've already covered. We just skipped over it because we had to cut about 100 things so that we could cover the 3 we did. And it's there is a philosophical argument for a creator in general, and this. Okay, we said that we were focusing on the ones that point to a God. You can even zoom out further in the arguments and say there is an argument for a supernatural. There is an argument for gods that deserve some kind of faith. So we even jumped in kind of midstream, and one of those philosophical arguments is why do so many people in the world believe in something? It's like we're hardwired for belief somehow. And that right there isn't even demonstrable or explainable through evolutionary theory. It's that there's something in us that cries out for something greater than ourselves. And that right there, it points towards an evidence of a creator of some kind. But at that point, we haven't even narrowed it down beyond Buddhism or Hinduism or all the other things. So I think that's what you're asking about and talking about. And we even jumped in a little bit.
And I think the second piece of that was, I just don't think that's true, right? Okay, and here's here's the thing, and I say it all the time, is God is a gentleman. Our God is a gentleman. He does not force us into relationship with him. So everybody has the choice to be in relationship with God or not. They can look at all of this evidence, and there are people who do, and
reject
just simply reject it. Because if you do, if you accept it, if you dive into it, the implication is that then you need to adjust accordingly.
Good questions.
Yeah.
Any others before we hit you with our questions?
These are less hard. These are less hard, but they're questions to ponder for the week. But anybody else? Okay, and again, as always, we'll be here afterward, and we can sit and talk longer. We're open to.
I need some coffee though.
Yeah, I'll get you some. Okay, these are questions to ponder for the coming week. These are just things to think about. You can have some. It's just regular latte. It's even lukewarm for you now. Which of these arguments for the existence of God seem the most compelling to you, and why? And think about that. And when I say think about it, and the why is that? Is there something in your background that it compels you to believe, to connect with those things more? Christopher, scientist, absolutely connects to the scientific side of the argument. Are you more connected to the design of biology? And so really think about why that is, because God has designed you individually, and he's designed you to connect to different things. And then our goal here is to give you as many of those things as we possibly can in the time that we have. The second question is, do you have any friends, any family that fall into one of the objection camps that we talked about? Relativism, naturalism, atheism. Those are major ones. There's lots of others, but in one of those. When you think about that person, what evidence for the existence of God do you think would be the most compelling for them? And why? And then the third one, how do these proofs and evidence change your perspective on your faith? And so these are just questions to think about over the coming week, questions to really ponder. And I mean, you can go as surface or as deep with any one of those questions as you want to go. Okay. So let's close. I have a prayer in here for you for this week. And I'd like to close us in this prayer, and then we'll go ahead and shut down. It says this: Thank you, God, for giving us clues that point to your existence through cosmology, morality, and your perfect design. Help us to rest confidently in your presence, knowing our faith is based on experience with you and evidence for you. We pray this week for those whose eyes are not yet open to your presence, that these evidences would be an awakening. Amen. Amen. Yes. Let's go ahead and hit stop on the recording, Christopher, and you can mute everything. And before you guys go, we have one more thing.